To the session on caregivers in the workplace. My name is David Storm. I'm going to be merely the panel moderator and navigating us through some stories today. But as far as introductions go, we'd like to know who's in the audience too. How many people here are caregivers? Currently?
As a profession or?
No, as a non-professional. Okay. How many people here are actually employees or employers? They have a workplace. Okay. How many happen to be in the occupation of human resources or employee assistance? Some. Social workers, home health care. Okay. Good, good. Well, this program is Caregivers in the Workplace, and as far as an educational component, we've got some stats. I have about one. There's a study that was done by the Center for Law and Social Policy that shows that 25% of all workers in the United States have elder care responsibilities. That means somebody is worrying about ma or pa, or grandpa and grandfather. That's 1 out of every 4. So there's 1, 2, 3. Is anybody here named Melanie?
Sounds like a psychic.
Thank you. Imagine Melanie is sitting in this chair. She's worrying about mom. Okay? So 1 out of every 4 of you just counted off. Probably not really a big concern, but 1 out of 4 of you has some responsibility. And the study has shown that the more of an ailment Melanie's parent or grandparent has, the more of a workplace concern there is. Workplace stress takes the form of scheduling conflicts or taking time off. This next hour, we'll be talking about and highlighting how to recognize the signs of elder care stress in the workplace and how to access what community resources and employer resources there are and how to alleviate some of those problems. We have here on our panel Joe L. Sasser, who is an independent financial advisor, Suzanne Myers on the end, Geriatric Care Manager with Encompass Senior Solutions, Kelly Watson, really on the end, Estate Planning Attorney with Marks, Clare, and Richards, and Vicki McHugh, who is in-home physical therapist for Key Physical Therapy, and then David DeCant, who is an EAP consultant with Best Care Employee Assistance Program. Melanie is merely only one of my imaginary friends. Her mother, Mabel, has just been admitted in the hospital through the emergency room. So imagine we all work for Acme Incorporated right now. Acme gets a phone call, where's Melanie? Miss Suzanne, what is Melanie going through right now?
In the next hour, we're going to throw a lot of things at you because Melanie's going to have a lot of things thrown at her. But more than likely, she's sitting at her desk or doing something in the office and gets the phone call that mom fell and is en route to the hospital. And so she's thinking of what she needs to do at work to get out the door. But she's also thinking of who's going to pick up the kids, who's going to finish what projects at her table, what's going to happen at dinner. What she might not know is nowadays the average length of stay in the ER is 6 hours. So she may be spending 11, 12, up to 23 hours with her mom. And so all of those balls that are in the air right now are going to be dropped, but she probably doesn't know that en route. She's just worried that mom broke something, hurt something. So she lands in the hospital and people are expecting her to make immediate decisions on whether they're going to admit her. If they're not going to admit her, is she safe enough to go home? Will she go to her own home? Will she go home with Melanie? What are all those things? What does it mean? Is it any place safe for her mom? For the sake of argument, we're going to say she didn't break anything, but she did have a fall. So she's a fall risk, which puts her in a different category. People are a little worried. Chances are now in this day and age she would not be admitted. But for our presentation, she's going to be admitted because the nice people in the emergency room is going to put at least a 24-hour hold on her, which means Medicare will pay. So she's not terribly concerned about that. But maybe she has cats or dogs or something at home. Her life doesn't end because she gets admitted to the hospital. and it all kind of falls back on Melanie. So Melanie's thinking about all of that, and also projects back at work, and what's going to happen to her own family, and even simple things like how's dinner going to be made. That she's in the hospital now, stuck with her mother, and they're trying to decide what to do and what's the next step.
There's always a question of authority. Kelly, what kind of authority issues do we have to deal with?
So Mabel's now at the hospital and she's facing some very difficult decisions. And the first question is whether Mabel is competent to make those decisions on her behalf, or whether somebody else needs to step in and assist Mabel. Nebraska law defines an incapacitated person as a person who's impaired by reason of mental illness, mental deficiency, physical illness, or disability, to the extent that she lacks sufficient understanding or capacity to make or communicate responsible decisions concerning herself. So in order to be determined to be incapacitated, Mabel needs to lack the requisite mental capacity to make decisions concerning her health and her finances. If Mabel's competent when she's in the hospital, there's no immediate problem. Mabel can work through the steps with Melanie and the doctors, and they can make some care decisions. But if Mabel is not competent, Melanie suddenly, on top of everything else, has a huge problem. Who legally can make decisions for on Mabel's behalf? And in Nebraska, does anyone know if Melanie, as Mabel's daughter, can make financial and healthcare decisions on Mabel's behalf? No. Right. If she hasn't been appointed by Mabel in a document known as the power of attorney, then she can. So we're now at the point where Mabel is incompetent, Melanie is making care decisions for her at the hospital, but doesn't have legal authority to do so. Melanie's only option at this point is to petition the Douglas County Court, because Douglas County is the county in which Mabel lives, to have a guardian and conservator appointed. A guardian is simply a person who takes care of a person's being, takes care of their physical decisions, their health decisions. A conservator is someone who takes care of that person's assets. Guardians and conservators, there's good reasons to have them, but it can be extremely cumbersome and extremely costly. Guardians and conservators are required to attend annual training. They have to file annual reports with the court. They must attend annual court hearings, and they're generally required to be bonded. Overall, they're much more expensive and much more time-consuming and public than the other alternatives. So now in our scenario, Melanie's not only dealing with tough care and financial decisions, she also has the added stress of establishing a guardianship and conservatorship and the attorney's fees that go along with that. Now the big question: could Mabel have pre-planned to avoid the situation? Absolutely, she could have. In Nebraska, guardianships and conservatorships are generally only appointed when a person hasn't taken the time to do the proper planning in advance. If Mabel would have put proper estate planning into place prior to her accident, Melanie would be in a much simpler and less stressful situation, because she would have the tools that she needs in order to make healthcare and financial decisions on behalf of her mom. Mabel should have put a power of attorney into place, one for finances and one for healthcare decision. A power of attorney is simply a document by which you name another person to make healthcare and or medical decisions for you in the event that you're unable to do so for yourself. It can be immediately effective, so that when you sign it, that person can concurrently make decisions with you, or you can set it up so that it only becomes effective when you become incapacitated. The advantages of putting the documents into place as part of a properly executed estate plan is that it would have been much less costly to Mabel than establishing a guardianship and conservatorship down the road, especially in an emergency situation. Mabel would have had control of choosing who she wanted appointed. Maybe she wanted Melanie appointed, but maybe she wanted to name someone else. The option is much less public, as the courts are generally not involved. And if something happens to Mabel, like it does in our situation, Melanie is immediately armed with the requisite legal ability to make the decisions she needs to make. So the moral of the story is that had Mabel put some basic estate planning into place, this would be a much simpler situation for both her and for her daughter Melanie.
Let's assume time goes by and now a week or two down the road, Mabel is kind of stabilizing, Melanie's maybe stabilizing, but there's still things going on. What is Melanie going through in the next week or two?
I argued with the panel that there'd be no way she'd stay in the hospital a couple weeks. She probably wasn't going to be admitted, but I lost that battle. So she's been in, and she's made the magical 72 hours. So some people in the room who might know what that means is that gives her a free ticket to rehab if she chooses to do so. 80% of the people choose to do that. One of the reasons that's a great plan is for the hospital and for the benefit of the hospital, because what they have to do is provide a safe discharge, and what that really means is somebody else has to take responsibility for Mabel. And making another entity, making a skilled nursing facility responsible, then it relinquishes the hospital's responsibility. Melanie is still reeling because she's going between the hospital to home to work, maybe taking some time off, and thinking that everybody that's telling them what she should do has her best interest at heart or her mom's best interest at heart, which I'm not saying they do or don't, but sometimes the hearsay of this nursing home's the worst in the world, or this one's the best in the world, or my dad died in rehab, or whatever, it's all clouding her mind, and what she really needs to do is be able to concentrate on being a mother, being a daughter, and being a valued employee, all at the same time. And some discharges at the hospital, they give you 2-hour notice that you have to discharge, and they tell you that this is the only facility in town that has an opening. And so if Melanie hasn't done her homework, that's what she's going to think and fall back on, and think that blank is the only place for my mom. It's 22 miles away from my home. I'll never be able to visit her without taking more time off work or taking time away from my family. But she gets thrown in this river of making decisions with not having the information behind her to make good decisions. And that nothing's bad or good about that. It's just the way the system is. And the reason I argued about it is if she was in the emergency room and she had just had a hospitalization 30 days in a 30-day period, 99% of the time the hospital would not readmit her for the same thing, and it's all simple economics. They wouldn't get paid, Medicare would not pay again for the same thing. Same thing happens on the other side. When they discharge, if she comes back into the hospital within 30 days, the hospital's in trouble. So that's why a skilled nursing stay, which is usually 20 days, is the ideal situation, because the most critical time for another incident that would require hospitalization is in that 20 to 30 day window period. There's nothing magical about that other than that's what Medicare has figured out. So 80% of the people would send her to a skilled facility. The other 20% may take her home with in-home rehab. I'm an advocate for that because I think you do better in your own home environment if it's safe. Again, some people live in split levels, and we have all kinds of stories of people that hoard and kinds of things. But if it's a safe environment, she'd often do a lot better at home. And what I would like to tell Melanie is she should start planning for discharge when mom's in the emergency room, because no one lives in the hospital that I'm aware of. And so it's better to start at the beginning, and if the people know that a skilled facility might have to happen, to go and actually look at a few when you have days rather than hours to make that decision. So what we're going to do for the sake of argument is she did make her 72 hours, and she does get to go to a skilled facility. And so Melanie gets to take a little breather because she gets at least 20 days to try to figure out long-term care issues and see if mom can rebound, return back to her way of life, or if she has to make a longer range plan for mom.
Well, imagine we all do work for Acme Incorporated, and Miss Melanie is more and more distracted and just not here. And this is employers in the workplace. Dave, what do we need to deal with Melanie when her chair is more and more vacant?
Okay, and so in other words, how are the folks here at Acme going to be dealing with Melanie or her situation as time goes on? Once again, where are my managers and HR people? Where employers? Okay. Well, unfortunately, I would say most organizations are no more really prepared for this kind of situation than even Melanie would be. Okay, and in a lot of ways, they actually shouldn't be, because for the most part, that's not what we're about. We're here to actually run a business, and we're here to turn a profit. All right. And of course, we have certain expectations of our people in terms of their performance and the behavior and attendance. And so for the most part, we're not really thinking about these things. So it's when Melanie gets that call, often the supervisors, the coworkers are just as surprised as she is. Now, Melanie, of course, I'm assuming that Melanie's going to be in her 40s or 50s. She's been with the company for a while. She's been a good employee, and she's built up a certain amount of goodwill. All right? So, of course, in those first couple of days, weeks, I think most folks are going to be pretty sympathetic. Managers are willing to be flexible, have Melanie use her PTO, so on and so forth. So the first couple of weeks, it's not all that big a deal. However, let's take a look at this, because in a lot of ways, this is where child care was back during the 80s and 90s. Okay? A lot of women were entering the workforce, they had child care issues, and businesses needed to adapt. But it's a little bit different this time around, because this isn't exactly like child care. Child care, after you get the things set up in terms of the daycare and the time off, I mean, it's a fairly predictable thing. Kids go to school, they might get into the odd disciplinary issue, they might have the odd illness, but over time, that tends to sort of, as the child gets older, those kinds of interruptions tend to start to decrease. It's a much different situation with an elder care issue, because what's going to happen is, I'm sure this is not going to get better with time. Okay? Her health issues are going to start to escalate over time. There's going to be more and more of these kinds of phone calls. And because most caregivers, the first thing that goes is leisure time. Okay? Always the first thing that goes is leisure time. Caregivers tend not to take time and effort away from work, or from their families, or from their caregiving. It's always the leisure. So what that's going to mean is that Melanie is going to become, over time, more and more stressed, unless, of course, she gets help. She's going to be more and more stressed, and over time you're going to start to see some real issues arise. You're going to see a decline in the quality of her work, the quantity of her work. She's going to start having problems with deadlines. She's going to be spending more time on the phone trying to arrange things. Again, the quality and the quantity of her work, her attendance, of course, it's all going to start to suffer. All right? And at that point, of course, co-workers, after a while, are going to start to get frankly, a little resentful, as are the managers. Okay? And the real temptation at this point is to start seeing Melanie less as an asset, which she has been up to this point, and more of liability. And folks, again, for those in HR and for in management, this is something we need to really guard against, because number one, well, first of all, Melanie is an asset. She's been with the organization. She not only has a record of achievement, but she also has a fair amount of institutional knowledge. And that's going to be incredibly difficult to replace. Incredibly difficult to replace. So we need to see Melanie as an asset, because what also gets involved here, in addition to that resentment, is after a while, people's thinking starts becoming a little bit biased. And people start getting these sort of stereotypical ideas of what a caregiver is, and a mom is, and before you know it, managers might be starting to make personnel decisions, writing work assignments, all right, pulling people back off choice assignments. Maybe they're also starting to think, well, I can't really count on this person for a promotion. And if we're not really careful, then you're starting to skate over into some gender-based bias issues, and now we're looking at a possible EEOC complaint of some kind. So I would say that this, at least from my portion here, is realize that this is probably not good unless you've got some planning in place at the organizational level. If the organization is not planned for this, and this is something we need to do, because again, a quarter of the workforce already has these kinds of issues. And it's only going to get worse as more, and of course, the baby boomers age, and more people take on these caregiving responsibilities. So we need to continue to see these workers, we need to see Melanie as an asset and plan for this. And I probably raised a lot more questions than I answered, but let me move on.
Well, we can see then that Melanie's co-workers are realizing that they may have to take up a little bit more work, and her employer is maybe straining to see what's going on, but what is Melanie going through right now?
Well, Melanie has assumed a very large new role in her life as a caregiver. With that new role and responsibilities come lots of challenges and lots of sacrifice. You've heard about suggestions and ways to pre-plan for long-term care and what your mom needs to do to plan to take care of herself. We've heard from the HR perspective about the importance of institution or organizational planning. You as an individual who are now in a caregiving role have some responsibilities to yourself and to the relationships that you have to do some pre-planning, or at least have some tools in your back pocket to pull out relatively quickly for when this happens, because it usually happens in that telephone call, and then you step up into a brand new role that you haven't studied for, you haven't prepared for, you didn't even fill out that job application for, but here you are, and that's your new role. So I wanted to share with you a couple of things to give you those tools in those back pockets, and they're going to seem really simple, and you're like, how is that going to help? Or, oh, I won't need that because it's not that hard. Just put them in your back pocket. Use them, they'll be handy. The very first thing, and you probably have never heard this, the very first thing that you can do for yourself when this shift happens is to communicate. Communication is instrumental in everything that we do and the crux of so many important decisions and impacts in our relationships. But I encourage you to make that your first priority. Communicate with your family members who may or may not be informed of what's going on, your social network and friends, because you may not be able to make those obligations, those social commitments and leisure activities that you would, and communicate with your employer. Maybe you feel like you would be in jeopardy, let them know that something's come up, but both of you need to be on the same page so that you know there are things that are going to be outside of your control, demands that are being placed on you that you haven't planned for, but you're going to need to find a way to respond to. So communicate with everybody right away. Even if it's that you don't know what else to say, but this has happened. More to come later. And that's okay for now. The other thing that we recognize about caregivers is they're usually givers in other aspects of their life. This isn't a brand new role that they're coming into. So they're typically the ones that are in giving positions already, whether it be of their times, their resources, their talents. So one of the things you can do for yourself is ask that. You're probably in a chair position, so ask the vice chair to help out a little bit. Delegate some of your responsibilities to another committee member if you can. Find a way to say no, at least not right now. Even if you only take a short break while you get through this crisis moment. We also know that with a caregiving role like this, it doesn't usually end in that 72 hours after that hospital admission. This is going to be something that's going to be changing across the next months to years in your life. And so taking a look at how you manage your overall stress. There are things that you can do that no one even has to know about, whether it be at your workstation, en route to and from your workstation, in your car. So these are a couple of things that I want to chat with you about now. The first thing is to breathe. I've been chatting on and on and on, and I'm not taking nice deep breaths, but taking those nice deep breaths, ending a phone conversation, taking a few seconds before you turn back to your workstation. One of my favorite things to do is take the long way to and from the restroom. You need to be taking restroom breaks. You can't avoid those as hard as you might try. So take the stairs, go to the one on the lower floor. Maybe you don't come straight there and back. You just stop at the window, take a few breaths, recite a poem, say a prayer, sing a song, whatever the case may be. Just take those extra minutes. No one needs to know about it. It's not going to interrupt your work environment. But it's something small, something simple at your workstation or at your workplace that you can do for yourself. Another thing I like to encourage people to do is take a techno break. We're all plugged in, across all ages. So especially as we move into a chronic caregiving situation, really encourage you to designate a time of the day where you unplug. The radio's off, the TV's off, the cell phone isn't accessible. You let people know. I take from 5:15 to 5:28, whatever the case may be. However many minutes you can sneak in there, it's okay. And say, I'm not answering my phone, I'll get back to you after 5:30. It's okay. Guess what? People didn't used to be on demand like that all the time. Things were still addressed. Things were still covered. So give that to yourself. Turn off the radio on the commute home. Just take a techno break. The commute to and from work. Nobody ever thinks on the way to work all the 73 things that they need to get done before lunch, I'm sure. Take an opportunity. You have your red light, you have your stop signs. use that as an environmental reminder to take a couple of deep breaths, let go of the steering wheel. We don't even know how clenched our shoulders are. How hard are you pressing on that brake? And do you really need to press that hard? Relax the grip, relax the ankle. Check how tense your face is. Maybe even you let your jaw and tongue relax a little bit. Almost everyone carries their stress in their shoulders and jaw. We cut off our own air supply when we have that stress in our throat. So do a check of that. Just let go at that stop sign or that stoplight. Take that few seconds to just decompress. As you move forward, again, I encourage you in your work environment particularly to make sure that you're communicating, especially as it moves from an acute or a crisis moment into a chronic situation. Maybe you do need to go to your supervisor and say, I need to be reassigned from this committee. It's going to be looked on better if you do it proactively than if they make executive decisions or management decisions to remove you from a position. It's showing your awareness, it's showing your ability to communicate and keep the people that are in your work network informed of what's on your plate, what you can do, and what you can't do, because right now there are going to be some things that are going to have to be shifted. So, fold those things up, throw them in your back pocket, use them as your tool down the line. You as a caregiver have to take care of yourself, your sleeping habits, your eating habits, your nourishment. All of those things are going to go by really quick, come quick to the bottom of the list. But for you to continue in your roles and relationships, family, social, work, and your personal health, important strategies to make sure you as a caregiver are taking care of yourself.
1 out of 4 have elder care responsibilities in the workplace. And if we were all independently wealthy, we would have to be in the workplace. End of the day, there's still a dollar that's involved with this, Joe.
No doubt. And from a financial perspective, really what Melanie is going through is impacted tremendously by what Planning Mabel had done in advance. I know this is a theme that you're seeing first at the organizational level, then at the individual level from a legal perspective. But realistically, from a financial perspective, it's entirely dependent. What Melanie should be focused on right now is making sure that mom's in the right care setting and getting the care that she needs, and whether that care is being provided at home or elsewhere, as opposed to thinking about, oh my gosh, how am I going to pay for this on an ongoing basis? So that being said, the vast majority of the time, that advanced planning doesn't happen, okay? It doesn't. And so what you see is a situation where Melanie's having to make hard decisions about how we're going to pay for care for mom. Which assets do we spend first? What do we do about the house? What happens? How do we pay this bill versus that bill? But if you think about Melanie's situation, I think this is the part that a lot of people don't think about. The typical caregiver, as Dave mentioned, is late 40s, early 50s. She's also working. She works on average 21 hours in that informal care setting on top of her regular job. 92% of people who are in a caregiving situation report substantial changes in their work habits or their work schedules. And actually 41%, the typical reduction in paid labor and paid hours for a caregiver is about 41%. So when you start to think about the financial impact, it's not just the financial impact on Mabel and mom, it's the financial impact on Melanie. So if Melanie has reduced work hours and a whole bunch, reduced paid hours and a whole bunch more work hours, she's impacted in an awful lot of ways at her level also. She probably has reduced access to employer-provided benefits. Less work hours means less 401k match at minimum. We can keep it that simple. But less work hours also means less contributions to things like Social Security and payroll taxes. Things of that nature have an impact on Melanie's long-term financial security. So yes, it's absolutely about Mabel, but it's also about Melanie. Frankly, it's really amazing to me, being a guy and not really in a lot of ways a caregiver type of personality. It's really amazing to me the clients that I've seen that just keep these balls in the air for so long, and by the time I get involved in that process, the choices have become so narrow because they were doing it. They were handling it the whole way along the way. And that's just, I mean, that's, every time, I gotta say, it's truly impressive to me. The thing is, the earlier in the process somebody starts to plan from a financial perspective, the far broader the options are. Now I'm going to give you, just over the next couple of minutes, a couple of things that are common knowledge, but when applied in a caregiving world, are not. So I'll give you the first major example is financial advisors all over the place. We've had beaten into our head this rule of thumb: you always spend the IRA money last. Right? You always spend the IRA money last because you're getting all this double compounding and all that. Everybody's heard it in the 401k presentation at work. Well, that rule gets turned on its head when you're in a caregiving situation. And the reason that rule gets turned on its head is because deductibility. You know, when you have medical expenses or care expenses that exceed 7.5% this year, it's going to go up to 10, but 10% of your income, it's deductible. So what that means is if you actually spend, you know, the 401k dollars or the IRA dollars first, you're using pre-tax dollars to pay for care. I mean, that's one really simple thing that you see all the time, just because of this rule of thumb that sticks in people's heads. There are also some recent changes, you know, from an advanced planning, I guess. Long-term care partnerships are a program that were recently introduced. I'm sure everybody in this room has heard at least something about the long-term care partnership programs. But what long-term care insurance allows someone to do is basically insure against this, you know, caregiving expense. The partnership programs are a little bit unique in that they provide an additional incentive. So they will allow someone to effectively shield from having to spend down for Medicaid purposes whatever amount of dollars in coverage they buy. So if I buy, you know, a total of $100,000 of long-term care coverage, that's $100,000 of my own money that I don't have to spend, and yet I can still qualify for Medicaid. So that's an incentive that's been put out there to help encourage people to do that kind of planning in advance. The two others for that advanced planning that have happened recently are the addition of riders. Basically, on a life insurance or an annuity policy, you can now have a long-term care rider, which just allows that policy to pay in a tax-advantaged way for long-term care. You know, so those are two possibilities that are, if you start to think about planning way down the road, you know, someone is going to say this. I'm surprised we haven't heard it yet, but the plan as if you're 80 at 50 kind of concept, those strategies are really available for that kind of thinking. Now, when you get downstream, deciding which assets to spend first is really critical. Another thing that we're seeing more often is care contracts. You know, when you look at Melanie's situation, she's got a financial impact for providing care. She's got reduced work hours. It's impacting her own financial security in retirement. And if Mabel does have some assets remaining, it can make a lot of sense to actually structure a payment for Melanie for providing that care. And there are some major advantages to doing that in a structured way. It can allow you to qualify for other benefits faster, you know, like Medicaid or like veterans benefits. Those are two of the most common reasons for structuring a care contract. Now, of course, there are really good ways and really bad ways. Frankly, this is kind of a scary area right now because, you know, you really have to be watching out for Mabel and making sure that it's not a child who doesn't have Mabel's best interest at heart. But that being said, when the situation makes sense, that's a technique that can make a lot of sense. And then finally, there have been some changes to the rules for reverse mortgages in the last few years. It used to be there were substantial upfront initiation fees in reverse mortgages. Those mortgages now look a lot more like a traditional mortgage. And so, you know, the upfront costs that used to be upfront costs are now rolled into the loan, and it looks a lot more like a more traditional mortgage, with one major difference, and that's that, you know, if you owe more than the house is worth at the death of the owner, you don't. It's non-recourse. You don't owe that balance. So those are just some of the examples. Realistically, in that couple of minutes, those were 8 considerations: 3 for early planning and 5 for what to do when you're in a crisis situation. And the fact is, the sooner in the process we start to look at those things, the broader the choices are.
May I ask you just to come back to the care contract? You really pointed out one of the advantages, or some of the advantages of that, and just lobbed out there is some disadvantage. Could you highlight where those pitfalls might be with a disadvantage of the care contract?
Well, I'd say the first is a psychological disadvantage. When you think about Melanie's role, Melanie loves her mom. Melanie doesn't want her mom's money. It's not about mom's money. At the end of the day, none of this is about mom's money. It's about making sure that, you know, assets are used efficiently. And so, while Melanie doesn't want mom's money. Melanie is being put in a very difficult situation. And so sometimes, you know, a third party talking about that certainly does help. So first off, I'd say, yeah, there's a disadvantage, and that's an uncomfortable conversation. It just is. It's an obligation that a lot of people hold in the back of their mind, that I'm a caregiver and I'll do whatever it takes, and I'm a caregiver. It's not even that. This is my mom. I'll do whatever it takes. It's just a question of approaching it, you know, maybe from an impartial third party. Hey, what is the best way to use these resources over a lifetime? So, as far as other disadvantages, really the other big disadvantage is a situation where that's not the mentality. And where that's not the mentality, you know, sitting in my shoes, or I'm sure, Kelly, you've experienced this also, where it's like, I just don't think we're the best fit. I'm the best fit for you. And sometimes you are in a position where you turn away a potential client because you don't want to get into that ball of wax for someone whose goal is not pure. I mean, when you get right down to it. So.
Well, we're still looking at Melanie and the employee workplace. I mean, her performance expectations really may not have changed, but her performance may have changed. From the employer, where are we going to look at now that it's weeks and months down the road?
Okay. As I talked a little about it earlier, I think it's going to be important for us to realize that from an employer's standpoint, again, they've got a company to run. They've got a job to do here. And I think it's most useful, again, to sort of see, let's see Melanie as an asset that needs to be protected. And not only for Melanie, but also realizing it's not just Melanie. It's going to be Melanie and Maria and Monica and all these other folks as time goes on.
And John.
And John and Joe, and God, who knows, might even be a Dave or two in there, okay? So we need to start looking at this as something that we need to plan for. And fortunately, there's been some good thinking on this. I was just looking at the Society for Human Resource Management website. It has a lot of great ideas. We don't really have to restructure that much. We've got a lot of things in place in businesses right now that with a little tweaking can work very well, okay? First of all, number one, a lot of businesses are already comfortable now with flexible paid time off sorts of situations. Not just you have sick days, you have vacation days, and therefore the twain shall meet. You've got a much more flexible situation in PTO, all right? A lot of organizations are also becoming more flexible when it comes to actual flexible scheduling. So if we can do flexible scheduling, perhaps do some job sharing, cross-training of people so that that the position isn't empty when it's necessary, or when these emergencies come up, that somebody is there to fill in. That's terrific. So job sharing, cross-training, and even telecommuting for that matter. As companies become more and more comfortable with telecommuting, I think that's something also that would add a certain amount of flexibility. So we're already heading in that direction. I think it's just a matter of starting to explore that a little bit more, okay? The next thing that would help out a lot is taking a look again now at the benefit package, okay? A lot of organizations, of course, will offer health insurance, dental, vision, that sort of thing. And I think it would not be amiss to start looking at long-term care insurance or elder care insurance policies as part of, again, the benefit package that they're offering, okay? Something else that I think would help out a lot is linking caregiving issues to your wellness. Many organizations now have wellness committees, wellness programs, and linking caregiving to wellness is really a natural fit. Because the logic of it, again, is this. When you start talking about people who are doing caregiving, this is mom, as Joe pointed out. And they're going to give, and they're going to sacrifice, and the first thing that's going to go is going to be their leisure. Which means they're not going to be taking care of themselves, and it's going to start showing up in the form of stress. All right? So again, starting to use the wellness program, start to talk about caregiving in relation to stress management. So again, the training, the wellness training that you can do in that regard, the seminars, the little brown bag lunches, to start talking about these issues would be a huge improvement. So that's already there. You've got benefit package, flexible hours, you've got this health and wellness situation going. But that's the key. I think we need to look at it from I think it's useful to look at it as a standpoint of how do we protect this asset. Because again, with Melanie, I'm guessing, has been with the company for a while. She has this wealth of institutional knowledge. And replacing solid employees is a very expensive proposition. In fact, if the stats hold, it costs anywhere from 1 to 3 times that person's annual salary to replace them. So anything we can do to help those people remain on the job is a big help. And one last item too. A lot of times when all this chaos is going on, you know, the unplanned for decisions, the financial stress, the craziness, work also can be a bit of a refuge for people, because it is a place where they go every day. They understand the environment. They've got the process down, and a certain amount of stability and predictability can also be a great refuge. It can be that time where, okay, you know, mom's fallen down for the 700th time, and I get this going and this going. But at least for these few hours, the world makes sense. And I'm useful, the world makes sense, I've got people around me that know me and support me. So work can be a refuge. But I think that also means, though, that as HR people, as managers, we've also got to, and this is the last point I'd like to make in this regard, is we need to reach out to these people. Caregivers typically don't like to talk about the caregiving issues with people outside. It's a personal matter, it's a family matter. And so they don't necessarily want to talk about this a lot of times to other people because A, they don't want to be a burden to anybody else. And also they frankly might be afraid that talking about these kinds of things at work would not be welcome, because they might be perceived as not an asset, becoming more of a liability. So again, managers need to reach out to these people and realize that they're not likely going to talk about this for any number of reasons. But connecting with these people on a regular basis, finding out what's going on with them, again, giving them the opportunity to communicate is going to be important as well. And again, is this all making sense, or am I just blowing it out my ears? It's making sense, folks? Good deal.
We have built-in time to take some questions. Are there any questions at this point?
This is for Kelly. Mabel's widow, limited income, limited assets. Is Melanie on the hook financially for mom's care?
Unless she signed something, you know, unless she went into the hospital and said, oh yes, I'll take care of it, no, she wouldn't be.
Okay, what about the guardianship, conservatorship, when it has to go to the court? Is Melanie responsible for paying for that?
Melanie is responsible for using Mabel's assets in Mabel's best interest, but Melanie isn't responsible for using her assets to care for Mabel. Now, what sometimes does happen, though, is Mabel has no one who can access her accounts because she hasn't done this pre-planning. So Melanie goes in and meets with an attorney to assist her with that, and the attorney will say, yes, we're happy to assist you, but if for some reason we get into Mabel's accounts and find out that she has no assets, you're on the hook for our fees. Because anything that's paid from awards assets, and the ward would be Mabel, the person who needs care, has to be court approved. And that's one thing I actually do really like about guardianships and conservatorships, is there is that built-in structure where the court is reviewing it every year. That's in a situation like Joe was discussing, where you're worried about the child not having mom's best interest at heart. Those are situations where I like when guardianships and conservatorships are established, because there is that built-in security. Does that answer?
Yes.
I think this
Did you?
Oh, I just had a couple of thoughts on what you were talking about, companies offering. We've done some programs for a few companies in Hastings, and a big part of what we were educating HR people on and the companies is if what was her name? Not Mabel.
Melanie.
Melanie would have been prepared and known that someday this will be coming her way where she will have to take care of Mabel, being prepared for that day. And not only when the emergency comes, but what do we do and know exactly where to go to find the care that Mabel might need when she's at home, and so you can go to work. If they knew where to go by holding resource fairs, or like you'd said, brown bag lunches, where you have different agencies that do offer home care and services for the elderly to come in and share their stories of their agencies and what they do, then when something does happen, something clicks in there and goes like, who were those people that came to talk about?
Right.
Somebody that I can get in there to care for Mom.
Yeah, well, there's another resource. Again, this is something that works really well, because if you can offer people those kinds of resources, then you're saving these people's days, hours, sometimes weeks of having to run out and reinvent the wheel and learn all this stuff.
And they need to hear it over and over again.
And they do.
Because
That's why.
at that time they think, well, this doesn't pertain to me.
Exactly.
And so they don't pay any attention, and then so they need to hear it over and over again. And another thing that I thought of while you were talking also was what we find with caregivers is they don't self-identify, they don't realize that they're doing anything special, and so they don't do anything right away. And by the time they realize they're in stress and need, sometimes it's too late.
Exactly.
So
Because a lot of times these people also slide into these things. Mama's getting a little forgetful. Oh, I'll just stop by once a week and see how she's doing, and that becomes twice a week, and we can slide into these
and
things.
And they don't think that they're doing anything special. They're just doing. She was just doing what her daughter would do for her.
Well, exactly. And then, of course, when they start to give up on their free time, and they're not taking care of themselves, they start feeling stressed, and then depressed, and then begin to think, oh my gosh, I'm starting to resent this, and I feel like I'm a bad daughter, and now they really don't want to talk about it.
How many caregivers we've had that had to quit their jobs way before?
Oh yeah, about 20% of caregivers will retire early, or end up being fired, or choosing to quit, or going to half-time, and that has that big impact on their income, what Joe was talking about.
Is there some sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that Melanie might go through that she thinks, oh, poor me, the man's going to get me down?
Well, that depends on the relationship that she's been able to build over time with her manager. Now, hopefully, that there is again, over time, that they have built a positive, mutually beneficial relationship here. But that's not always the guarantee. But again, there's the potential for a self-fulfilling sort of situation. That's why just talking about it, this communication piece that you're talking about, absolutely critical. Absolutely.
What's funny is you mentioned the lunch and learn kind of concepts, and oftentimes they're not terribly well attended. The funny part is, though, when an employee remembers, a while back we had this lunch and learn. Maybe they didn't even attend the lunch and learn. They just know now, I'm going to go talk to my HR and say, who was that person you had?
And if
so it's not even
company leaves the information with the HR office, they can then reach out and refer them.
Okay. Well, Ted mentioned there was a question. Yes.
Does the company have a family leave absence where the employee can take off because it's a family?
Well, almost all companies right now, as I understand it, have, of course, I think every company over about, is it 60 or 100 employees? 75 companies? Well, a company that has 75 or more employees has to deal with the Family Medical Leave Act, which, as I understand it, HR folks, correct me if I'm wrong here, it's up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave to deal with, again, these kinds of issues. Caregiving falls very much under that. In fact, a lot of companies have even started to expand that now on their own. They give more than 12 weeks of leaves because, again, they know this is an invaluable employee. We do not want to lose this person. Also, if you're talking about HR folks, another good resource, if you happen to have one, is an employee assistance program. Because, again, most employee assistance programs will offer, again, you'll have individual and family counseling, and as a resource that becomes really useful as things start getting very stressful. A lot of EAPs will also do training and will do these kinds of brown bag situations and will have some expertise in these areas.
Then some employees have a buildup of sick leave or vacation time, and they give it to the employees that need it.
That's another thing people will trade off on that.
Yes.
Will donate that. Yeah, that's wonderful.
And then they have workshops maybe once a month where people can go to, where there's a counselor, a minister, and they talk to the employees about those things, and they give an in-service then to all the different departments.
I think the stark reality is, I agree with Suzanne, but that patient would not have gotten admitted because the hospital would be reviewed and then be subject to fraudulent care because the patient didn't meet acute care criteria. So hospitals used to be able to do that. We would get them in and then we'd look and look and look for something to meet criteria, but now the review is so stringent that we really risk being accused of fraud. And so the reality is that Mabel would have gone home and Melanie would have had to then provide her care. There would not be this 20-day anything for her. So, you know, the reality is changing.
And even with broken bones, and I mean, that's why I argued pretty strongly that she'd probably have a 23-hour ER visit.
But that's
and
not
then
inpatient.
Then she'd be sent home, exhausted
Yes,
and worn out, sitting in an exam room, and the problem still isn't solved, and the fall issue is still there. And so Melanie's left with even a bigger problem, because she has to take her home or put her back to where she fell to begin with, and neither situation's right.
That's right.
Well, and just from an in-home therapy or care advocacy standpoint, the in-home care can be covered by insurance, just for anyone that's advocating for elderly, that you don't have to have qualifying stay to have a funded home health episode. So even if they're saying that they're not being admitted, but they go home, you as a caregiver can still advocate for skilled service providers to come into the home and care for that.
On Medicare or private insurance?
Medicare doesn't require a hospital stay for home-based.
And so they have to be pretty much homebound.
As long as they're
except for
homebound.
going to the doctor or the
Correct.
grocery store. Or,
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
As long as they're
Homebound.
There are people that do fall through the cracks. Though if you don't qualify for an inpatient stay and you have to go home, the daughter may be disabled themselves and have, may need care of themselves, but that's all they have and they have no assets. So it can be a very stressful, unsafe situation for everybody.
Yes, it is. We never see that.
It's scary.
It's scary.
Shelley, did you have a?
Oh, I was just gonna add, after Mabel's been in the emergency room for 23 hours, she also hasn't eaten, so poor Melanie's gotta go home and find something to roll in.
Yeah. What's considered homebound for therapy?
Well, Medicare has definitions for what a homebound status, what criteria meet. There are 6. Is that right?
Well, and I think that's the therapy. You can if you're going to go home and you ask for in-home health care, you can have a nurse, an OT, a PT, a speech, and that sort of thing. But what people don't understand is that's in and out. That's not care. That's not, somebody that's there for 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day. And so Melanie's even if that's what happens, and I advocate that myself, that still does not prevent Melanie's mind from being, did mom fall? So then you put in things like Lifeline, so if she falls, then you get notified, well, then you're back home.
Right.
The situation doesn't change, and I have people who take their mom into the hospital 17 times in 17 days, and the hospital keeps churning them back out. The problem exists, and the resources are obviously not there, otherwise you'd already have paid caregivers. It's not that Melanie doesn't care for her mom. She might not have financial resources at all. So we're talking about no resources. It's not like they're clueless. Wow, I didn't know there was private duty that would come in and give my mom a bath and stay with her. It's I don't have the money, so even if I move her in my home, I have a split level. There's 13 steps up. Mom can't. She broke her hip, so she can't get into the house. Or she gets into the house and it's a fire hazard because you can't get her out of the house. That makes her homebound status, but doesn't help her situation, and it certainly doesn't make her safe. So I think we have more questions posed, then we're able to answer, but it's not an easy thing, and what I like to say is, going to the hospital does not solve one of your problems. Never does, never will, never has. And the 20-day stay in a rehab facility does not solve any problem. It just gives you 20 days to try to figure out what you're going to do next. And maybe the person can go home and maybe they can't. And the threshold there is 20 days usually makes or breaks it. You usually know if somebody can rebound or if they can't. So then that just gives you, but again, they wait until day 19. Until the social worker comes in and says, well, you're leaving tomorrow, and then Melanie's like, what? No one told me this, although they've been telling her. I think she's been told. But you don't hear it until it hits you right in the face.
Okay, if they stay in the hospital 20 days, don't they have a step-down unit in the hospitals now where they can go and be there for a longer time and Medicare will pay for it?
Rarely is anybody in the hospital 20 days.
Oh.
If they are, someone's in some big trouble.
Yeah, we are.
But they can't go to the step-down unit.
You know what, people call things swing beds and
Yeah.
step downs and all of that. It doesn't happen anymore, really.
Oh, I see.
What you do is you pass the buck. The hospital sends them to a skilled facility, and Medicare will pay for that next 20 days of rehab if the person is making progress. And again, that's not what you think is making progress. It's what Medicare guidelines says is making progress. And it's getting very tight. So that when you take somebody, it used to be, and you said it perfectly, it used to be you go to the hospital, you get admitted, you sit there for 10 days, and you get lickety-split well, and you're ready to go home. Now, if you get to stay, and if you make the 72-hour stay, all that does is give you a ticket to rehab, which gives you 20 more days, but doesn't solve any problem. I mean, your problem is you're getting weaker, you're a fall risk. I mean, there's other things that probably need to be put into place to make home a safe environment, whether that be going to an adult daycare while you're working, you know, thinking outside the box, not just thinking, oh, mom has to go home with me and I'm a split level and I have 3 kids and 6 dogs and I work 60 hours a week and it can't happen. I think you need to look at what can happen, and that's why everybody on the panel kind of has their little expertise in what can happen to make the right decisions. But people wait too long, and then there's one decision to make, and it's a really poor one.
Time for maybe one more question.
You said something about Medicare would pay for like skilled care in the home. Does it also pay for, say, like respite workers or other private pay type of people?
No. It's considered luxury care.
That's why that dependent care insurance or
The care contract is what you want to look at if people have any resources.
I get that question all the time.
Or a care contract that coupled with VA benefits too as well, if they're needing, you know, if they are a veteran or a spouse of the veteran.
Yeah. Okay.
That works sometimes.
Time for one last bit of clarification on the panel. Any other piece that you wanted to highlight before we kind of recap?
Close her down, Dave.
Close it down. It's almost a matter of pre-planning is the issue from Mabel, Melanie, and the employer. Melanie finds herself in this boat. It's almost a one-way trip unless she gets those help and resources. But from the employer's perspective, Melanie doesn't have to be the end. Melanie can be the beginning of planning for this issue as a benevolent employer to make sure they got more resources for the next time this happens with Melanie's coworkers.
And better than a benevolent employer, a smart employer, because this person is an asset. Melanie is an asset, and you're going to see a lot more Melanies, and a lot more Mikes and Martins and everybody else, so we need to get on it.
We handed out a little sheet of the cast of characters and some of the behind-the-scenes people. If there's any questions on any of these points, feel free to call any of us. Thank you all very much.